Good evening there, everybody. What is happening? Hopefully, you all are having a wonderful day today. So, I thought that I would review this little video that I thought was particularly interesting. Excuse me. And this video, all in all, is going to be by the network known as DAZN. And of course, DAZN, they had Canelo Alvarez as their highest paid fighter not too long ago. But I believe Canelo Alvarez, as of right now, he is known as a free agent. I'm not necessarily sure who he's going to fight with next. Now, his last fight, of course, was with Showtime when he did that fight with Mr. Caleb Plant. But when it comes down to it, I'm not necessarily sure who he is going to fight next. Well, actually, excuse me. I do believe that he is going to face Ilunga Maka, but what I meant to say is that I don't know what network he is necessarily going to sign with next. But this video is particularly interesting, and I made a video, and the reason why I decided to review another video about Canelo Alvarez is because, like I said in my video previously yesterday, there is going to be a certain amount of arguments later on down the line for Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, and there is going to be a great push for him to potentially be a top 10 boxer of all time. And I do mean that. Like I said, I believe that boxing has had plans with Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez for a very, very long time. There's a reason why boxers are coming out of the woodwork and getting after Canelo Alvarez more than any other fighter today, whether it be Marquez, whether it be Marco Antonio Barrera, whether it be, Eric Morales, who are all three, I believe, Mexican-born fighters. You even have Floyd Mayweather Jr. coming out saying stuff. Certain amount of all-time great fighters that are talking about Canelo, sometimes in derogatory terms. Why are they saying this? Because there is no other boxer in the world today that has a greater push to be an all-time great fighter than that of Saul Canelo Alvarez. And at the end of the day, I get it. Because like I said, whenever you watch a sport, they always want you to believe that whatever you're watching is the greatest thing that you've ever seen. Whoever the greatest fighter is of that generation, they want you to believe that that fighter is going to be debatably in the conversation with any other fighter in the history of the sport. And it's not just boxing. If you watch basketball, they want you to believe that LeBron James is debatably the greatest basketball player of all time. If you watch football, they want you to believe that Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers, that they're up there with anyone. And Tom Brady, of course, with his accomplishments, he certainly can argue that. If you watch tennis, Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, and Novak Djokovic, they're the three greatest men's tennis players in history. If you watch women's tennis, Serena Williams is, according to media, although I don't know if I would 100% agree, I think that she is on the, greatest women's tennis player of all time level, but I do think there is a couple of debates. But if you ask the women's tennis media, there isn't even a debate. She is clearly, hands down, the greatest women's tennis player of all time. Shit, they'll even tell you that she's the greatest tennis player of all time. But when it comes down to it, that's my point. When it comes down to whenever you watch a sport, especially the best fighter of that generation, there is going to be certain debates that they are the greatest possibly that you've ever seen. And I do think that there is going to be a certain push for Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, especially if he is able to somehow unify that of the light heavyweight division. I do think that there is going to be a debate about that later on down the line. Now, in my opinion, will Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez be on that level if he unifies the 175-pound division? Well, what I'll say is this. If he were to unify the 175-pound division and beat the likes of Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, especially, two fighters that are undefeated and A-grade champions, Canelo Alvarez, as I've already said, as of right now, he's within my top 40 to top 30 boxers of all time. If he were able to unify the 175-pound division, he would probably have to move in, certainly into my top 20 boxers of all time. And I know I'm going to have a certain amount of people get on my ass, and I know I'm going to have a certain amount of people say, oh, how can you rank Canelo Alvarez that high? How can you do this? How can you do this? And let me talk about this real quick. And the reason why I wanted to talk about this real quick is because I've reviewed a certain amount of videos before. Now, this isn't going to be from one of these channels because, of course, this is from DAZN. And as of right now, DAZN is going to be trying to push Canelo Alvarez to debatably be over some other all-time great fighters. In this video particularly, they're going to try to push him to be over that of Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. At least some of the guys are. They're going to have they're going to have a conversation about it. Listen, at the end of the day, you can tell that Canelo Alvarez is an all-time great fighter. And I have certain people that jump on my comment section and they say, oh, you just protect Canelo Alvarez. He doesn't fight the best. He's not an all-time great fighter, blah, 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 blah. All this other bullshit. And I had these certain people overall say, oh, Canelo is only so promoted because he's not a black fighter. He's a Caucasian Hispanic or he's a Latino fighter. And all those fighters always get, promoted highly and they always try to put him over black fighters. Listen, at the end of the day, I get it. When it comes down to it, I understand. Certain Caucasian athletes or certain Latino athletes, especially in certain sports where, black athletes, of course, so, especially American, black athletes, they can tend to be the most dominant. There is, things known as great white hypes or whether it be someone of the Asian demographic, Latino demographic, whatever. Whether it be Jeremy Lin in basketball, or, whether it be even Vasily Lomachenko to a degree in boxing, or, Tommy Morrison, all that is well and good. And to a degree, Saul Canelo Alvarez, do I believe that there's a little bit of a push for him to debatably be over other fighters? Is there a little bit of a racial thing there? Yeah, sure, you can certainly argue that. But at the end of the day, for those of us that are logical and objective, and I'm not a person that's braggadocious, but one thing I do know about myself is that I usually have at least the certain amount of intelligence to rank things logically and objectively. I see things usually on a very, very realistic scope. And when I take a look at Saul Canelo Alvarez, it's understandable that Saul Canelo Alvarez, when you take a look at him compared to almost any other fighter, at least active fighter that's today, he's just on a different level. At least overall, that's what I see as of right now. It's the same thing overall if I were to take a look at the UFC. If I were to take a look at Mr. Kamaru Usman, do I think that necessarily he is on the same level as that of a John Jones or George St. Pierre or, some of the other top 10 MMA fighters of all time? I don't think he's necessarily on that level as of yet. But you can tell that Mr. Kamaru Usman, you can tell that he is a real deal fighter. Now, am I going to sit here and say, oh, well, the only reason why they're promoting Kamaru Usman, who's an African fighter, I believe that he was born in Nigeria, or somewhere around there. But, am I going to sit here and say, oh, well, the only reason why they want Kamaru Usman over George St. Pierre is because they don't want a Caucasian debatably being the greatest UFC fighter of all time? Because George is in that conversation, at least debatably. I could say that all I want to, but at the end of the day, when we take a look at Kamaru Usman, he's a real deal fighter. It just is what it is. It's the same thing with Saul Canelo Alvarez. Saul Canelo Alvarez, you cannot have the list of champions all in all that he has and not be an all-time great fighter. It just is what it is. And people can say all in all that he continues fighting cupcakes and he continues fighting, these C-class fighters. But at the end of the day, that's just not the truth. Now, if you're someone all in all that, was like a Leo Santa Cruz, who at the beginning of his career, or like a Mikey Garcia, or like a Gervonta Tank Davis, to where for a very, very long time, they fought almost no A-grade fighters, sometimes not even B-grade fighters in their career, then you would have a point. If you're someone overall to where you're saying, well, the only reason why Naoya Inoue is pushed so hard is because he's Asian, and I think all in all that he is a great fighter, but do I think that he's partially pushed because it is trying to attract that Asian demographic? Most certainly, yes. Listen, bottom line is this. You have to expect that, when it comes to sports, especially when it comes to, a different demographic dominating all of a sudden in a sport to where it's usually dominated by another demographic. So when it comes down to it, especially because the United States, which is, one of the more popular, bigger states in the world, one of the bigger powers, they are going to try to promote certain Latino athletes or certain Caucasian athletes because they want to overall market that, to the main demographic. It just is what it is. That's a part of it. But the big question overall for those of us that are logical and objective, are those guys the real deal? Is Saul Canelo Alvarez just some dude that because he's a Latino, some would debate him as a Caucasian Hispanic, but I would say he's a Latino with Caucasian roots? What I would just say is this, when it comes down to it all in all, is Canelo Alvarez just, ranked the number one pound for pound fighter because he's just a Caucasian or a Latino or, they're just trying to rank him above every black fighter, all this other stuff? Listen, I understand where people's points are coming from at the end of the day. But if you take a look at things logically and objectively, no, Saul Canelo Alvarez is not just ranked the number one pound for pound fighter just because he's not a black fighter. Once again, when you take a look at Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, there's a reason why he is ranked number one pound for pound on almost every single list. It is what it is. Once again, this man has Araceli Lara on his resume. And I understand that it was a bit controversial, but at the end of the day, you can debate that Araceli Lara should have threw more and been a little bit more offensive in that fight. It just is what it is. The first fight against Gennady Golovkin, when it comes down to it, yes, I personally thought Gennady Golovkin won. But the fight after that, I thought that Canelo Alvarez clearly won. And that was a top 5 pound for pound win at the time. You're also talking about a dude that has beat Austin Trout, Miguel Cotto, Sergey Kovalev. Every single one of these fighters were champions when Canelo Alvarez fought them. He beat Danny Jacobs when he was a champion. He beat Billy Joe Saunders when he was a champion. He beat Callum Smith when he was a champion. He beat Caleb Plant when he was a champion. At the end of the day, all these fighters you can debate at the time were at least on an A grade level some way, somehow. So people can come in my comment section all day. They can come with this bullshit and they can say, oh, the only reason why Saul Canelo Alvarez is ranked so highly is because he's just a Caucasian Hispanic or he's a Latino. No, that is not the only reason why Canelo Alvarez is ranked so highly. It is what it is. All right? It just is what it is. Canelo Alvarez is a person that is a very special and talented individual. And at the end of the day, like I said, is there going to be a certain amount of push for him to be greater than other black fighters because he is of a different demographic? Sure. But at the end of the day, Canelo Alvarez, like I said, if you truly know what you're watching, he's an all-time great fighter. It just is what it is. It's the same thing if you take a look. Like I said, I'm a tennis watcher. I love to watch the sport of tennis. I know the old legend of Arthur Ashe. Now, he's a black tennis player. He was an all-time great black tennis player. Now, that's a sport that is 99% dominated by Caucasians, not only throughout its history, at least throughout the 20th and 21st century, but also throughout today. There's not a whole lot of black dominant tennis players. There's also not a whole lot of Latino dominant tennis players. It is primarily dominated by the European demographic. It just is what it is. But does that mean that Arthur Ashe was not an all-time great tennis player? No. Do you also think that he's going to get a little bit of an extra push because he was a black player in tennis, which is mainly a Caucasian-dominated, thing? Yes, he's going to get a little bit of extra push, but at the end of the day, for those of us that are logical and objective, we have to take a look at it and say, okay, is this dude really all hype, or does he have some talent there? And at the end of the day, it's the same thing with Saul Canelo Alvarez. We can take a look at this with anything. When it comes to rap music, if you listen to hip-hop music, we can take a look at Eminem. Sure, he's a Caucasian artist, and do I think that there's a certain amount of promotion behind him because of that? Sure. But at the end of the day, he is one of the biggest selling artists of all time. He does have some very talented music, when it comes down to it, if you're a listener of him. So once again, people can say all this bullshit all they want to. But at the end of the day, that's why I say, for certain people to review these videos, or certain people, I don't know, to give their opinions out there, it's very, very rare that a certain amount of people, like I said, have the actual intelligence of a scope to be very decently logical and objective, because most people do not have that type of scope. And I'm not trying to be braggadocious here. I'm not saying that I'm an Albert Einstein or whoever you think is the most intelligent person that you've seen, whoever the hell it may be. I'm not saying all in all that, I'm the most intelligent person around. But what I am saying is that I do have the right amount of intelligence to at least be logical and objective about these conversations that I talk about. And I go into depth about these conversations, and overall, I know my history, at least about these conversations. So it is what it is. And like I said, when it comes to Saul Canelo Alvarez, you can think about whatever you want to think about him. But at the end of the day, he is an all-time great fighter. It just is what it is. But in this specific conversation, they're going to be specifically talking about if Saul Canelo Alvarez has he already surpassed Mr. Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. And I think that that's a very interesting conversation, because there's actually a certain amount of people that would debate that he has. There's a certain amount of people that would debate that he has not. I'm going to give you my personal opinion in this video, and we're going to see what they have to say.
All right, many times when you are determining who the fighter of the year is, a case can be made for multiple fighters. However, in 2021, I don't think anyone can dispute that Canelo Alvarez is hands down this year's winner. 3 fights in 2021, 4 fights in an 11-month span. He cleaned out the 168-pound division as he became the first Mexican-born fighter to become an undisputed champion. The first fighter.
And of course, a certain amount of people may say, well, he only fought the weakest champions there. Listen, I understand that at the end of the day, he didn't face David Benavidez, who some would debate was the most talented fighter there. But at the end of the day, like I said, I don't view David Benavidez as this world beater. And to me, Caleb Plant, David Benavidez, and Callum Smith, and Billy Joe Saunders, they're all on a very, very similar level. If you want to say that David Benavidez is more athletically gifted than some of those guys, I wouldn't disagree with you. But in terms of skills, no one is taking a look really at David Benavidez and saying, wow, that dude is just next level. I mean, I just don't see it. Now, his athleticism and his pace is very, very good. But like I said, I don't think that he's the boxer to defeat Saul Canelo Alvarez. Now, once again, as I've explained before, that doesn't mean that I would not like to see those fights. But at the end of the day, I cannot really criticize Saul Canelo Alvarez that badly for going after Caleb Plant and Billy Joe Saunders, fighters that were undefeated and champions at the time. And you could tell that those guys were all very talented fighters. People can bitch, moan, and complain all they want to, but like I said, the same people that said that Canelo was cherry picking, that the same people that say if Jamal Charlo faces Caleb Plant next, that it's a very decent fight. If you don't believe me, check out my channel. Check out the video that I made a couple weeks ago where I said new media overall basically admits that Canelo Alvarez is the best, because Dante's vaccination completely tore down the Canelo versus Caleb Plant fight. But as soon as his boy Jamal Charlo went to go face possibly Caleb Plant, he said that it was a decent fight. So like I said, we all know their narratives. It is what it is.
to become undisputed.
And do I believe that Saul Canelo Alvarez deserved Fighter of the Year? Yes, I do. Because I don't know another candidate overall that I would have given it to. I think that the Deontay Wilder win, that Tyson Fury had, that was a great win. But not only did he already get that win, and in my opinion, in more dominant fashion last year, but he only fought once, so I couldn't give it to Tyson Fury. Usyk, I think, beat a couple of people. He did beat Anthony Joshua. But I don't know if I would put him Fighter of the Year, even though it was a very, very decent win. But becoming undisputed for Canelo, I think, was a very, very decent accomplishment. Some may debate Josh Taylor because he was able to beat Jose Ramirez and become absolutely undisputed. Some may debate Terrence Bud Crawford because he was able to defeat Sean Porter. I cannot put any of those fighters, at least in terms of Fighter of the Year, above Saul Canelo Alvarez. Within the past year, he's fought 4 people. One of those fighters was a C-class fighter in Avni Yildirim. The rest of them were at least on the A- level, and he completely unified the 168-pound division. Whether you want to admit that David Benavidez overall, or whether you want to overall say that David Benavidez was more talented than those guys or not, that's up to you. But at the end of the day, Canelo beat every official champion there. So it is what it is. And every single one of them, whether you want to say that they're on the David Benavidez level or not, all of them, in my opinion, were at least on the A- level.
At super middleweight. Barack, let's begin with you. What is it going to take for Canelo Alvarez to be recognized as the greatest Mexican boxer of all time?
It's going to take Sergio Mora to leave him the heck alone, first of all. That's one thing. And you know what? My favorite book says that even a prophet doesn't receive respect in his own home. And I think while fighters are here, it's hard for them to get the clout that they truly deserve. He's beaten 16, 17 champions.
I would somewhat agree with that. And that's not just in boxing, but that's in whatever sport when it comes down to it. Like, people take a look at recent players. Like, for example, if you know the Allen Iverson fanboys, if you were around during the early 2000s and you watched basketball. Now, I was not, I was born in 1998, so I can't, tell you that I full on remember Allen Iverson's prime years. But by the time I watched basketball, I obviously knew who Allen Iverson was. And I've seen a certain amount of highlights. Allen Iverson is a great player. He's also one of the most overrated players to play in NBA history. He's a great player. He's a top 50 player of all time, in my opinion. But let's compare him to that of a Steph Curry. You can't put him over as Steph Curry, but the Allen Iverson fans, if you tell them that to their face, they'll say, oh, you can't even compare Steph Curry to an Allen Iverson. Actually, yes, you can. And not only, actually, if you want to say that there shouldn't be a comparison, it should be the other way around. Because Steph Curry, all in all, was an all-around greater and better player than that of an Allen Iverson. Greater shooter, more proficient when it comes down to it, better overall at winning, better overall at helping his team, more accomplished, more MVPs, more championships. There really isn't even a debate. It just is what it is. But current players sometimes, and current, professions, or certain people overall that, certain athletes, or certain people within their profession, it's always very hard to compare them to that of old, because people basically take a look at that and they say, those guys are basically the gods of that, and I don't like to look at anyone like that when it comes down to it, but that's what a lot of people look at it like that. It's basically going to be very, very hard to get past their aura, because, they're going to be remembered for a very, very long time. Just like Michael Jordan in the NBA. If someone is going to surpass Michael Jordan, it's going to be a very, very long time, because they're going to have to at least get 6 championships more than likely, and it's gonna overall have to take a lot of accomplishments.
Far surpassed Julio Cesar Chavez in the amount of champions he's beaten. Julio Cesar Chavez has never been undisputed, and just eye test alone, if anybody
Well, Canelo Alvarez is undisputed, but once again, let me say this. Just because someone is undisputed does not necessarily mean that they surpass someone, in my opinion, that was not undisputed. We take a look at the pound-for-pound list, for example. I would not put Terrence Bud Crawford above that of an Alexander Usyk, and, well, actually, that wouldn't be a good argument, because Alexander Usyk was unified at one point in time completely. But let's just say, all in all, let's say not, God, I'm trying to think of, a good comparison when it comes on. Let's say overall Josh Taylor. Josh Taylor is completely unified overall right now. And when it comes down to it, let's say Errol Spence has never been completely unified, but I would not have Josh Taylor above Errol Spence on my pound-for-pound list. So just because you're unified does not always mean that you're a greater fighter. Kostya Tszyu is another example. Kostya Tszyu at one division, he all in all was, now of course, Canelo's a bit different, because I believe Kostya Tszyu, he was only a champion in one weight division. Canelo is a 4-weight division champion, and he unified, one champion, one weight class at that, so I get it. But at the end of the day, just because someone unified, championships or all the championships within one weight division, that doesn't always necessarily mean that they're greater than a fighter that didn't. Like for example, I've had certain people tell me, well, do you think if Saul Canelo Alvarez not only unifies the super middleweight division, but the light heavyweight division, that he'll be greater than Floyd Mayweather Jr.? I'm not sure if I would debatably argue that. I would say that maybe Canelo one day can be at least in the top 10 conversation, but like I said previously, I don't know if Canelo Alvarez will ever definitively be above someone like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. Because like I said, Floyd Mayweather Jr., in my opinion, he's in that top 10 to top 5 conversation. That means what? He's in that conversation with anyone in boxing history. Now I think Canelo maybe one day can get to that level, but it's going to take a decent amount of work. And I think that he's certainly on the right track. If he retired today, he'd be a first ballot Hall of Famer, no doubt about it. But when it comes down to it, if you want to get on that level, it's going to take a decent amount of top contenders in your career.
The world says eye test alone that Canelo is not better than Julio or any other Mexican, they're lying. But I don't like to...
Well, at the end of the day, that is your opinion. Listen, I've already stated this in my opinion. Mr. Saul Canelo Alvarez, he is the best in terms of skills. He is the best Mexican boxer that I've ever personally seen. Now, I've had certain people come on my channel, I'm guessing Mexican boxing fans or Mexican-American boxing fans, and they've told me, well, I personally believe that Chavez Sr. and Salvador Sanchez is above him. And I've seen both Salvador Sanchez and Chavez Sr. highlights. Of course, I was not around during their time. Both extraordinary fighters. I don't think either of those fighters were as multi-dimensional as a Saul Canelo Alvarez. But that's just my personal opinion.
Argue that, and I'm sorry I even brought that up, because he's past that already. We're talking about Canelo as one of the best fighters of all time, and that's because of resume. Whenever we talk about great fighters, we talk about...
You see that? Like I said in my video, I should be like Boxing Ego. The great ego, Ego Stradamus strikes again. Man, I'm on top of my game. Anyway, but like I said, overall, like I said, there is going to be a certain amount of people that are going to try and project overall that narrative that Canelo, that eventually he's going to be within the top 10 boxers of all time, or debatably the greatest of all time. All right, there's been certain narratives overall that have been coming out about that. Whether you think he deserves to be in that conversation, that's up to you. Right now, Canelo would be within my top 40 to top 30, undoubtedly.
What they did, and Canelo is beating everybody right now.
And let's not get into Julio Cesar Chavez Sr.'s resume.
Well, let's say this. When it comes down to it, Canelo does have to continue this dominance because Saul Canelo Alvarez... Now, if you want to argue that Saul Canelo Alvarez is debatably over Chavez, I would not necessarily have a problem with that. In my personal opinion, maybe Chavez may be slightly above Canelo just in terms of... because I think his dominance maybe was a bit longer. But I do understand what people are saying because I do believe Canelo has beaten more champions at this point in time when it comes down to it. And I do think all in all that he actually is more skilled than that of a Chavez Sr. But Chavez Sr., like I said, in my opinion, he's debatably within that top 10 of all time. I don't know if I would put Canelo quite there yet. But, he could be eventually.
Type of fighters
and I think, to be honest with you, I think that it more than likely probably is going to happen that way. But there is a certain amount of top contenders that Canelo does have to beat. And overall, like I said, Artur Beterbiev, Dimitri Bivol, David Benavidez, Jamal Charlo, Demetrius Andrade, Joe Smith Jr., and who the hell else, knows is going to pop up. But those are the main ones that Canelo has to focus on.
Fighting after 50 fights, after 60 fights, after 65, 70 fights, guys with 7 fights, 5 fights, 4 fights. That's not even getting into that. I mean, just to echo Barack. When you talk about skill set, and accolades, doesn't that define what a great fighter is? So there's no question about him being better than Cesar Chavez Sr. But we'll let you counter that, Sergio.
Allow me to retort. Look, man, when it comes to the Gran Campeón Mexicano, what he did was win hearts and minds, man. What he did was, you can't erase that nostalgia of how he made...
You see what Sergio Mora said? This is why I say you really have to get past the aura. Because what Sergio Mora just said is that, oh, well, basically, it's all about the nostalgia. What, overall, this, and this, So there's going to be a lot of people, all in all, even Mexican fans, even if they adore Canelo Alvarez, they may say, oh, well, Canelo will never be on that Chavez level. He never brought the same happiness to me. It's like, that's the same shit that I always hear in tennis. when it comes to Roger Federer versus Novak Djokovic, I always hear this bullshit. In my opinion, Djokovic has already surpassed Rafael Nadal and Roger Federer when it comes down to it, especially if he continues winning Grand Slams. But what the Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal fans will say, yeah, Djokovic, he might end up with the most Grand Slams of all time, but he'll never have the finesse, overall, the niceness, the class of, like, no one cares about that shit. I'm sorry, but I don't care what you do in your personal time. When I'm ranking you as a fighter or when I'm ranking you as an overall athlete or, someone who is a great successor in your sport, all I care about what you did was in the boxing ring. All I care about what you did was on the tennis court, the basketball court, the football field. I don't give a shit what you did outside of your profession. Don't care about that at all.
You feel that's what it is. He carried a whole country on his shoulders, and it was a lot different in the 80s and early 90s when Chavez was fighting because there was no social media. You had a whole family. You had neighbors come into a one-bedroom apartment. I'm speaking for myself in East LA. We would have parties and fiestas. You can't erase that, man. It's a lot different. The accolades, the historical references, yeah, you can make comparisons. The belts and everything that he's done, Canelo, yeah, he's already surpassed them in that sense. Statistically, he's already passed them. But you got to remember how people feel. That's all I'm saying.
Well, let me quote overall some of the channels that I've reviewed as of lately. Even though I think that they don't use it as well as they should, but facts over feelings. Overall, facts do not care about your feelings. So Canelo Alvarez eventually one day, in my opinion, more than likely will probably surpass Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. Some would debate that he's already ahead of him. So it is what it is. Once again, I don't care about how you feel. When I first started watching boxing, I actually didn't start watching current boxers. The first fighter that I started watching, old video clips of, Mike Tyson. All right, I didn't even know who some of the other all-time great fighters were until I was about 13, 14 years old. I'm serious. I didn't even know who Muhammad Ali was until I was about 12. Almost everyone of my age had heard of him. I didn't know until I got into a game called Fight Night Champion. I didn't know who Muhammad Ali was until then. But Mike Tyson was my favorite boxer because I had always heard his name when I was a young kid because he was one of the more recent boxers, of course, who fought in the 90s and a little bit in the early 2000s when it came down to it, and of course the 80s as well. So Mike Tyson was a person that I would always hear. And I was a big fan of Mike Tyson when I first got into boxing. And, when I, the nostalgia overall that I would watch some old Mike Tyson fights and I would say, man, no one's greater than Mike Tyson. But when you take a look at his resume and when you become more logical and objective, Mike was a great fighter, but you can't put him on the same level as some of the other all-time great fighters. Like, you can't put him on the same level as Muhammad Ali. You can't put him on the same level as an all-time great heavyweight like George Foreman. You really can't even put him on the same level as a Tyson Fury because Tyson Fury not only is undefeated, but he's won every big fight in his career.
Well, I felt great when Big Daddy Kane came out, but guess what? Then Jay-Z came out, and the rest is history. So, you can still love an old fighter, but if somebody's better, at some point you got to say, you're just better.
You can make the case for Canelo.
I would agree, but let me say this. I think Sergio Mora, I don't give a shit really how people feel. That's just personally my opinion. But I think what Sergio Mora mentioned was important because that's how the majority of people feel. They don't really care overall about, the stuff that you have to point out that is factual. They care more about their nostalgia, their emotions, blah, 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 blah. So even if one day there is a NBA basketball player that may surpass Michael Jordan in certain accomplishments, or let's just say all around everything, people are still going to say, I don't care what they say, he's not greater than Michael Jordan. Take a look at the Kobe Bryant, fans, for example. They'll still say to this day, they have no factual evidence on their side when it comes down to it. They'll say, I don't give a shit what LeBron or these other players do. Kobe's still greater than them. And there's almost no evidence whatsoever. It just is what it is.
Being on the way. But you're not going to appreciate his greatness until it's passed. When it's already passed, when you're looking back at Canelo's career, then you can say, like, wow, you know what? That he was greater. But in the meantime, you can't do it.
You have a tendency, Sergio.
Well, in the meantime, when it comes down to it, you maybe could debate that Chavez Sr. is greater just because some would debate in certain accomplishments and him it's close. And Chavez, all in all, he had quite the run. So some would maybe debate that Chavez Sr. is still above Canelo. But do I think that it is inevitable that eventually Canelo may surpass him? Maybe. We'll see what happens. But I think that it could be likely. But that means that Canelo, that he is going to have to continue facing top contenders because that is what the number one pound-for-pound fighter does.
To commingle boxing skill and icon status. I don't think Canelo Alvarez will ever surpass, as you said, Julio Cesar Chavez in the hearts of and minds of Mexican fans. He may not even surpass someone like Salvador Sanchez in the hearts and minds of Mexican fans.
And I think he has a point there, because I've had a certain amount of people tell me, even people who like Canelo, that they agree.
Question is, what can he do to become the greatest Mexican boxer of all time? I do think it's a lot closer than Ak and Barack seem to think it is right now. What Canelo can do is one very simple thing in 2022. Fight and beat Alexander Usyk. That's the fight
And like I said, that's how you know Saul Canelo Alvarez is on a different level. There is no other boxer in the world right now, even Terence Crawford or even Gervonta Tank Davis or Errol Spence or Alexander Usyk or Fury. But of course, those guys are pretty much the upper weight classes. So of course, it's hard to ask them to fight anyone bigger. But let's say even if they were in smaller weight classes, no one would ever ask them to fight someone that's literally like twice their size. Alexander Usyk would literally have, I mean, I know certain people, they tell me, well, Canelo, he's seen that type of height and reach before. Yeah, but he's never seen that on a fighter type like Alexander Usyk. Someone who has A+ stamina, decent power for that division when it comes down to it. Great feet, great skills. That's why I say Alexander Usyk, he's a bad boy. He's not someone to just mess around with. That's why I say if that fight happens, it's probably going to have to happen at somewhere near the end of their careers. And I'm not sure if that fight's ever going to happen in the first place because Canelo, he's like, 31 years old right now. Alexander Usyk's 34. So we'll see what happens.
Want to see in 2022. We've heard from Usyk over the last few weeks say, you know what? I'd come down and wait for that fight. I'd even drop back to cruiserweight for that fight. I don't want that fight at cruiserweight. I don't want that fight either.
Like basically what that would be, that'd be like Gervonta Tank Davis, who in my opinion is one of the top fighters in boxing. That'd be like Gervonta Tank Davis going up to welterweight and facing someone like a Terence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr. That's exactly what that'd be like. And you can debate that those guys could possibly even face, at 154. That's pretty much what that fight would be like. Because Alexander Usyk would have a 7-inch reach advantage and a major height advantage over them. Same thing with Terence Bud Crawford and Errol Spence over that of a Gervonta Tank Davis. That's basically what that would be like.
I don't want that fight either because people aren't going to be happy. People are not going to be happy until Canelo gets beaten or knocked out. And guess what? That's also what adds to the chapter of greatness.
I agree.
A great
when people are basically calling you to take challenges that they wouldn't do with any other fighter, it was the same thing with Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao or Muhammad Ali or a certain amount of other fighters. There's always a great amount of hate. They always say that artists are never appreciated in their own time, or the greatest of artists are never appreciated in their own time, as much as they would be later on. It's the same thing here.
And stumble and come back. Every great fighter had to come back from bad losses, from Ali to Robinson to Sugar Ray Leonard. That's what people...
Well, most fighters. Not everyone did. Floyd Mayweather Jr., Rocky Marciano did not have to come from bad losses. Joe Calzaghe, Andre Ward did not have to come back from bad losses. So it is what it is. Not every fighter... had a loss on their record. But of course, the majority of great fighters did. Or, fighters in general did. It just is what it is.
They don't want they don't want the perfect, squeaky clean guy in Canelo always beating everybody. So they want him to fall just for he can rise again.
Sergio, you have the boxing ambition of Sven Otke. I swear to God. You
Who the hell
don't want these... Exactly. An undefeated fighter who didn't face anyone back in his prime. We want these guys to challenge himself. There's nobody at once.
Damn, I don't know if he was talking about Sergio Mora's career or I'm not sure exactly what he was hitting at there. But anyway.
68 that gave Canelo Alvarez a real challenge.
Or maybe that was a shot at Floyd Mayweather Jr. I don't know. But if his case in point is that someone like a Floyd or some of them other undefeated fighters fought nobodies, let me actually talk about some of them undefeated fighters. We all know Floyd has fought repeated champions. He's an all-time great fighter, so I'm not really going to talk about Floyd. But let's talk about Joe Calzaghe. Let's talk about Andre Ward. Let's talk about Rocky Marciano. Especially Joe Calzaghe and Rocky Marciano, because like I said, especially boxing, which is a sport that is usually primarily dominated by that of black athletes, especially of today, there's a certain amount of people overall that want to say, oh, well, Rocky Marciano, he was only debatably great for his time because he was this great big white hype when it comes down to... No, Rocky Marciano was a great fighter. There's a reason why he was undefeated. There's a reason why he didn't lose to Ezra Charles overall, or he lost to Joe Walcott or whatever the hell his name was. But Joe Louis actually lost to a couple of those guys. Rocky Marciano, at the end of the day, was he the prettiest fighter? No, he wasn't the prettiest fighter. He didn't ever look like Muhammad Ali. He didn't ever look like, someone, that had A+ technique, at least not at the beginning of his career. But he was a great athlete. He was an all-time great athlete. And for someone that actually, I believe, still to this day, at least out of any other all-time great heavyweight, had the shortest reach out of any other all-time great heavyweight champion with a 67-inch reach. Keep in mind, that's a Miguel Cotto or Manny Pacquiao type of reach. And he was a heavyweight champion, and he ended up being undefeated in his career. That's phenomenal. And when you talk about Joe Calzaghe was an all-time great fighter as well, in my opinion, about top 30, top 40 of all time. He's on that Bernard Hopkins, Canelo Alvarez level as of right now. Andre Ward level. Joe Calzaghe didn't always look like he had a great, technique, but he was an A-grade fighter. He was an A-grade skilled fighter. That's why he was undefeated in his career. And he did beat a couple of very decent boxers. And, of course, the biggest winner of his career, in my opinion, was that over Bernard Hopkins.
I'm not so sure there's anybody at 175.
And let me talk about that fight as well real quick, because there's so many people that always tell me, and I think we all know which people they usually are, but it just is what it is. And they basically say, oh, well, Joe Calzaghe, he fought with Bernard Hopkins life and death, and Bernard was like 50 years old. Like, come on, man. Bernard Hopkins was still at the best point in his career. I know people all in all are going to say, oh, no, he wasn't because he lost to Jermaine Taylor a couple times. Yeah, then after that Jermaine Taylor fight, he would beat the Ring Magazine champion Kelly Pavlik. He would beat overall Antonio Tarver. And then later on, he would beat John Pascal. So it is what it is. You can't say all in all that Bernard Hopkins was not at debatably the best point in his career when he got really the best wins of his career at 36 plus years old. It just is what it is. They both were at the best points in their career. Joe Calzaghe pulled out the victory. End of story. And if we're talking about Andre Ward, we all know how great Andre Ward was. Now, if I wanted to make the bullshit point like I've heard a certain amount of other channels make about our certain fighters, I can say, oh, well, how many all-time great fighters has he really beat? Sometimes that doesn't really matter. If you're a person that, defeated the best of your era, that's really all that matters. Andre Ward, at the end of the day, has wins over Carl Frosch. He has a win over Mikhail Kessler. He has a win, I believe, over Arthur Abraham, Chad Dawson, Sergey Kovalev. All right? And I could be missing a couple of other names, but at the end of the day, those are all great wins. Andre Ward deserves a lot of credit.
Give Canelo a real challenge. What did Roy Jones do to make his legacy? He went from 175 to around 200 pounds, fought John Ruiz, and became the heavyweight champion. That's what...
Yes, and that's why I compare the Makabu and Canelo Alvarez fight very similar to that, at least somewhat along the same lines. Now, if you're asking Canelo Alvarez to become the heavyweight champion by defeating Alexander Usyk, that's a completely different situation. Because like I said, Canelo versus Alexander Usyk, that's a lot different than a Roy Jones Jr. versus John Ruiz. Let's keep in context, Roy Jones Jr. was 6 foot, and he had a 74-inch reach. Canelo Alvarez is 5'9", maybe even if that, when it comes down to it. Could be a bit, give or take. Could be a bit taller, could be a bit smaller. I'm not necessarily sure what his exact height is. But on top of that, he has a 71-inch reach, I believe. If he faces Alexander Usyk and somehow is able to pull off the victory, Canelo might have to be 100% for sure in my top 10 of all time.
Want Canelo to do?
Chris, I think you're asking too
Usyk
much.
is not a big... Why? Why am I
Because
asking
Canelo
too much?
started fighting at 140 pounds. He fought at 147 so many times. At 154, this guy is smaller than me. How can you expect him to fight a guy who just beat Anthony Joshua for a heavyweight in a heavyweight showdown? And he's not a small cruiserweight. He's 6'4", 6'3".
I agree. He's 6'3" with a 78-inch reach. Once again, that'd be asking Gervonta Tank Davis to move up to face Errol Spence Jr. or Terrence Bud Crawford. That's pretty much what that would be asking for.
6'4".
And of course, I would not ask for that because even though I think Gervonta Tank Davis is a tremendous fighter, I don't think that he should go anywhere above 140.
We're asking too much of this guy, Canelo
I
Alvarez.
don't think. Hold on. I don't think we're asking too much because Usyk.
Yeah, you are.
To get Usyk to get down to the catch weight it'd have to be at would have to drop like 20 pounds to get there from his last fight. That
Right, but when it comes down to it, Usyk probably rehydrates right around 222 pounds anyway. A lot of those cruiserweights do, at least if they're fighting at the regular 200-pound weight limit. So it is what it is. A lot of people don't understand. A lot of these guys, when they rehydrate, they can be at least 13, sometimes over 20 pounds bigger than what they were. There's certain people that balloon up, like Terrence Bud Crawford. He used to fight people at 140. He ballooned all the way up to like 161 pounds. Like, that's why I say, Terrence, his build is a natural welterweight. At least with Canelo, now he does balloon up quite a bit. He does balloon, I believe, up to like 185, 190. but that's pretty much around like, you know, the middleweights or, you know, maybe super middleweights. That's probably around like middleweight range because Gennady Golovkin, he probably, you know, I believe that he's a natural middleweight. He probably rehydrates around the same.
Will drain him. And let's not act like
Because some of them super middleweights, shit, some of them, I can guarantee you, they may be able to rehydrate over 200 pounds.
Usyk is this massive puncher. When he was at cruiserweight, he wasn't really knocking anybody out. So yeah, Canelo could lose.
No, he's not a massive puncher, but he's a good enough puncher to hurt Saul Canelo Alvarez. Really, actually, to be honest with you, Alexander Usyk is a good enough puncher to hurt anyone. You know, Alexander Usyk reminds me of Floyd Mayweather Jr., you know, a little bit later on in his career. Everyone always loved to say that, you know, he couldn't punch, but, you know, he stung a couple of people. You know, not a lot of people would just be straight up walking through his punches. You know what I mean? So it is what it is.
No question about it. But isn't that worth the risk? You take a loss against a guy like Usyk, it's better than fighting a junior Makabu at cruiserweight.
No, but it just seems like it's never going to be enough
Let me say something. First of all, you are one of the people who call Triple G great, and Triple G has never left his division. Canelo doesn't have to
I would agree.
do another freaking thing for people to realize that he's great. He can retire tomorrow, and 20 years from now, people are going to realize he's one of the best fighters of all time. I'm not going to talk about that Mexican crap. He's one of the best fighters of all time. He's small compared to the junior.
This dude, Chris Mannix on the left, I believe is his name. This is who Dante and Boxing Ego and all those dude alleges this alleged super huge racist, and he could be. I don't know. I haven't really watched enough of him. But when it comes down to it, you know, could this be potentially, possibly for pushing for the Usyk-Canelo fight, or could he maybe be doing this to even put a little bit more sauce on Canelo Alvarez's argument for being an all-time great fighter? It could be. It could be that type of tactic, but, you know, I don't know.
Middleweights. He's smaller than Jared Hurd. He's smaller than Charlo. He's a small guy. He's just great. So it's
Well, in terms of weight, he's probably around the same size as Charlo. But Charlo, in terms of course, height and reach, I believe, is, you know, he's bigger than Canelo in that terms.
just not fair to ask him to go up to anything. He shouldn't even be fighting at 168, really.
Well, what I am going to say is this. If Canelo Alvarez is going to be compared to that top 10 level, you know, I don't think he necessarily has to beat Alexander Usyk. But, because to be quite honest with you, if Canelo was able to beat Alexander Usyk, he'd probably have to be, you know, debatably my top 5 of all time, to be quite honest with you. If he can still, you know, potentially beat some of the other top contenders. That's why I don't think that fight should happen right now. I just don't think that it's realistic. Because if he ends up beating Usyk, let's say, you know, sure, he'd be on top of the world. But if he ends up going back down and somehow draining himself, he may end up just like Roy Jones Jr. Even though I think Canelo... Actually, let me say this about Canelo real quick. Canelo is one of the greatest chins that I've personally ever seen. I think I've seen Canelo stunned in 2 fights total in his career. One was over Miguel Cotto's older brother, when Canelo was a bit younger. That's the most stunned I've ever seen Saul Canelo Alvarez. And another fight, of course, was in the rematch against Triple G, who, of course, is one of the hardest hitters in boxing history.
Into his size, but nobody's telling Triple G go up. Nobody's telling these other fighters go up. No, Canelo's already proven to be great. He should not be fighting the cruiserweight. That's crazy.
But we're still like we're still jumping from the.
And that was my point when it comes down to it about when, you know, Boxing Ego and a certain amount of these other guys, they were saying, oh, well, so Canelo Alvarez, you know, he should fight Usyk if he's really serious about fighting a cruiserweight. Well, let me ask you something. If Devonta Tank Davis was going to go face a welterweight, would you call him out to face Terrence Bud Crawford or Errol Spence Jr.? And then if he lost to those guys, would you say, he's not as great as what many people thought he were? Of course you wouldn't say that. Like I said, this is why I compare Canelo Alvarez previously to that of a Floyd Mayweather Jr. or Manny Pacquiao. Because when you're on that upper echelon, when you're on that level that no one else is, people overall, they're going to be giving you challenges or they're going to make requests of you that almost seem impossible. So it is what it is. Asking for a David Benavidez Jamal Charlo fight, Demetrius Andrade fight, that's not impossible. But there's a reason why a certain amount of people overall are asking for him to fight Alexander Usyk.
The question though, what would make Canelo the greatest Mexican fighter? I think winning a heavyweight title would seal it. Because Sergio
Well, that would certainly seal it. That not only would make Canelo Alvarez the greatest Mexican fighter of all time, that would basically definitively make him the greatest Latino fighter of all time. Right now, I think he's in that same conversation, or, you know, the greatest Latino fighters of all time. They're Roberto Duran, Carlos Monzon, Julio Cesar Chavez Sr., and maybe I'm missing a couple of others. Canelo, I think, is maybe slightly behind them, maybe on their same level. Some would debate. But when it comes down to it, I'm not going to say on their same level quite as of yet, because some of those fighters, in my opinion, maybe were debatably a little bit more proven. So, like I said, at the end of the day, if Canelo is going to be on that top 10 level, I need to see him possibly unify 175, or at least better be even Bivol. And then later on, face Charlo, Benavidez, Andre, those guys. So there does need to be some sort of consistency here. So we'll see what happens.
Sergio clearly believes he's not on that level yet. So I think let's say
Time
hypothetically,
Well, Sergio's in his feelings. So it is what it is.
Sergio, I got a serious question for you, Sergio.
Like I said, it's like, certain people when they take a look at Tyson Fury and they're like, oh, Fury would have got fucked up by Evander Holyfield and Mike Tyson and Lennox Lewis. You can allege that all you want to, but at the end of the day, let me just say this. If Fury was a black fighter, no one would be saying that. Because none of these channels, that were a huge fan of Deontay Wilder, none of them were ever saying that. None of them were ever saying that if Deontay Wilder fought Mike Tyson or Lennox Lewis, that he'd get fucked up, even though he probably would lose to those fighters. Do I believe that Tyson Fury would lose to those fighters? I don't know. There's no way to constitute that. If you're asking me, I think that Tyson Fury against any heavyweight in history, because of how skilled he is and his size, and also because of the decent power that he has and the decent athleticism, I think he has a decent chance over anybody. But it is what it is.
Seriously, based on skill and accolades alone, is Canelo Alvarez better than Cesar Chavez Sr.?
Yes, I'll give you that, but that's not enough.
That's what is.
Why would it not be enough? Listen, at the end of the day, I think that they're somewhat on a very, very similar level. Canelo is getting there, though.
That's what this fight game is.
You know what Sergio did? Sergio didn't do any stats when he spoke. He just gave us the reason why he's the emotional champion.
I would agree. The people's champ when it comes down to it. It is what it is. But listen, at the end of the day, you can debate Chavez Sr. We do have to take things into context, when it comes down to it. Stats sometimes can be somewhat misleading, but certain numbers also don't lie at the same time. So you have to really know overall how to read them. In my opinion, so Canelo Alvarez, is he definitively greater than that of Julio Cesar Chavez Sr. as of yet? I'm not going to put him on that level quite as of yet, because Julio Cesar Chavez, in my opinion, he was in that very top pound-for-pound conversation for years and years and years. So Canelo Alvarez, in my opinion, he certainly has been a top pound-for-pound fighter for years and years and years. There's no debate about that. But so Canelo Alvarez, how long can you be the number one pound-for-pound fighter, or at least within the top 2, top 3 conversation? That to me is who the all-time great fighters are in terms of the top 10, top 20. Fighters like a Floyd Mayweather, Sweet Pea Pernell Whitaker, Roy Jones Jr., Carlos Monsoon, Rocky Marciano, Muhammad Ali, Manny Pacquiao, Roy Jones Jr., if I didn't mention him, Marvin Hagler, Sugar Ray Leonard, Roberto Duran, Chavez Sr., those fighters.
But it's not
Hearts and minds.
on
Nostalgia, yeah. Nostalgia and hearts and minds.
Then who's really better than guys like Arturo Gatti? You know what I mean? So, no.
I think that's a decent point as well.
It's about what you did in that ring.
Look, guys.
Because I agree. Because if we talk about emotions and fanboyism, we can sit here and say, well, Arturo Gatti, I was always more of a fan of him than, say, like Miguel Cotto. But at the end of the day, if we were to take a look at him, there's no debate about who the greater fighter is. It's Miguel Cotto. It is what it is.
Sugar Ray Robinson is the greatest fighter of all time, but they don't mention him when they talk about the greatest. They talk about Muhammad Ali, because Ali changed hearts and minds. What he did.
No one gives a shit about that. I'm sorry. Well, let me not say that. There are people who give a shit about that, but people overall who are the logical and objective ones, they don't give a shit about that. I really don't give a shit. I don't care if you were a mob member behind the scenes. It really doesn't matter to me. If you're an all-time great athlete or an all-time great fighter, you're an all-time great fighter. It just is what it is. All right? There's certain people out there that I believe are a piece of shit when it comes down to it. All right? There's certain people out there that I think are human piles of trash. John Jones, Conor McGregor, for example, they'd be decent examples. But you would have to say at the end of the day, they are first ballot Hall of Famers for their profession. It just is what it is. There are certain, NFL players that I take a look at. O.J. Simpson, for example. Now, there's a lot of people that believe that he didn't kill those people. There's a lot of people that believe that he did. Whatever your opinion is whatever your opinion is. But at the end of the day, let's just say for this circumstance that he 100% for sure killed those people. At the end of the day, he still is one of the all-time great running backs to do it. Just is what it is.
for everyone outside of boxing.
He also beat almost every man he fought.
He also lost, and
And
those
came
fights,
back
and he had to
and
come back,
rematch.
and that's what won hearts
But
and
are we
minds.
blaming?
And I don't know this narrative overall about certain people. They say, oh, well, if Canelo wants to surpass Chavez Sr. or some of these other fighters, like these all-time great fighters, and they'll even put Tommy Hearns or Bernard Hopkins in this level. And it's like, how the hell are you going to compare Tommy Hearns or Bernard Hopkins to someone like, a top 10 level fighter of all time? Like, that just doesn't make any sense. Like Dante's Boxing Nation, I watch his channel, and he'll say some stupid shit like, you know what all these boxers have in common, the greatest of all time? They won the biggest fight in their career. Did Tommy Hearns win the biggest fight of his career? The only big fight of his career that he ever won, let's be real, overall that was against an A-grade fighter with A skills, was Roberto Duran. And you should have won that fight because Roberto Duran was like literally half your size. It just is what it is. But you couldn't beat Sugar Ray Leonard, even though I personally did believe that you beat him in the second fight. But you didn't get the decision. It just is what it is. You got knocked out by him in the first fight. You got knocked out by Marvin Hagler. It's like, how great is Tommy Hearns really? Don't get me wrong, he's a great fighter, but to put him on the top 10 level of all time is just ridiculous. Same with Bernard Hopkins.
Canelo Alvarez for only losing.
But when we talk about Julio Chavez Sr., he's a great fighter, but also at the same time, now Chavez Sr., he has said this point, and I understand his point to a degree. Basically, what he has said is that, yes, Canelo Alvarez, he's moving up the upper weight divisions, but he basically has the body for that. Not only that, but he has alleged that Canelo is on some sort of PEDs. And do I believe that more than likely he is probably on some sort of PEDs? It's very likely, but like I said, I believe a lot of these boxers and athletes today are more than likely on something anyway. So it is what it is. So if that's a barometer for you, then it's a barometer for you. It just isn't for me. Now I can compare it. I can basically say that, maybe that's a reason why I would maybe not put Canelo over, Chavez completely, because maybe fighters, back then were not on as much steroids or as much supplements as they were today, because of course the supplements and the steroids and the PEDs and, the health supplements, they're always getting better and better. So certain athletes, they may last longer and longer, at least in certain professions. So that's a little bit understandable. But at the end of the day, so Canelo Alvarez, once again, you can tell he is an all-time great fighter.
To Floyd Mayweather, is that a problem because you haven't lost again?
No, he was 23. He bit off more than he can chew, and he was great for even doing
But that's
that.
my point. No, what you're saying is that you.
Well, listen, at the end of the day, let me also nip that narrative in the bud. Canelo was an A-grade fighter when he fought Floyd Mayweather when he was 23. He was in his prime. The only thing that I would say is that he was not at his peak like he is now. But the thing is with Mr. Sewell Canelo Alvarez is that I'm not sure if you ever, because Canelo was a dude that's 5'9", 71-inch arm reach. Floyd was a dude that was about 5'8", exactly 72-inch arm reach. I just think it would have been too difficult for Canelo to beat someone like Floyd because I think they fight very similar. I think Floyd, all in all, he just has the advantages in most things. Of course, I think Canelo has naturally more power when it comes down to it. Of course, he's bigger when it comes down to it. But Floyd, at the end of the day, really what he is he's almost like a greater version of Canelo when it comes down to it. Because Canelo does fight somewhat similarly here and there like a Floyd Mayweather Jr. He can fight multidimensionally as well,
I want to see guys challenge themselves, take losses, come back. But because a guy is that good in a ring and is not losing, should we fault him for that? We don't fault Floyd Mayweather for it.
No, you should not. Yeah, look, I'm sticking to my hearts and minds. I'm sticking to nostalgia. You always remember how people made you feel, and the way Chavez made up.
I get that when it comes down to it, and Sergio Mora, I think, is speaking for probably a lot of fans that watched Chavez Sr. back in the day. And let me put this in context. Was Chavez Sr. probably on the same supplements that Canelo or same PEDs that maybe Canelo Alvarez is on today? Probably not. Or, speculatively anyway. But at the end of the day, so Canelo Alvarez, in this world of boxing today, he is the best, at least as of right now.
Whole community, a whole country, everyone that's Latino, any boxing fan, he really changed a generation. And that's what we remember. So Canelo's doing that for a different generation. And look, let me touch on something. Man,
like I said, that's that Allen Iverson syndrome. Allen Iverson fanboys, they'll tell you all the way up and down that Allen Iverson is one of the greatest players to ever play. And he is one of the greatest players to ever play. He's just not on the level that a lot of people say that he is. It is what it is. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not comparing Chavez Sr. all in all, to that of an Allen Iverson. Chavez Sr., of course, for his profession is a hell of a lot greater than that of an Allen Iverson. But at the end of the day, you know, the reason why I'm comparing it to that is because a lot of people overall in these debates, they get in their emotions and nostalgia rather than logic and facts.
If you cover basketball, it's the exact same thing with LeBron James and Michael Jordan. You grew up watching.
I agree, but the difference there is that Michael Jordan is legitimately better and greater than that of a LeBron James.
And I'm sure praising Michael Jordan. Do you think LeBron James is the greatest right now?
Could be. His career's not over yet.
I'm asking you.
His title runs is over, in my opinion. It's over. I don't see LeBron James with the way the Lakers are going right now. You can tell LeBron James is slowing down, and I don't know what other opportunities he has. I think LeBron James' titles runs are over. You know, no, LeBron James is not the greatest basketball player of all time. There's a lot of people that haven't been in that conversation, and it's a great compliment. It means that he's at least somewhat on the Michael Jordan level. He's not completely on the level, but he's at least within that top 10 conversation. So, you know, it is what it is.
Who's the greatest, Michael Jordan or LeBron James?
Michael Jordan right now. But LeBron.
Oh, why? But LeBron James already beat him with every statistic. Same old thing.
Not
Yeah, but basketball is different than boxing. I understand what Sergio Moro overall is trying to say, but that's a completely different conversation. When it comes to boxing, you can take a look overall at a certain amount of the champions that they have beaten, and, you know, not only that, but the accuracy rating and a certain amount of other things. It is what it is.
really,
No, he
because my
didn't.
MJ still has more rings than LeBron. And MJ
Except
still
the
has.
rings.
He doesn't just have more rings than LeBron. He has more everything than LeBron James. I've never really gotten the LeBron James Michael Jordan conversation. How can you really debate LeBron James is greater than Michael Jordan when one player has more rings, he has more MVPs, he has more defensive accolades in a shorter amount. All this within a way shorter amount of time, by the way. Like, it's not even close. Don't get me wrong. LeBron James he's somewhere in that echelon. You can both debate that they're in tier 1, but they're at 2 completely different tables.
But still a no.
Except the most important thing. You know, so what you're saying is Canelo's better, but I like Chavez more. That's basically what you're saying.
That's it.
Pretty much, but it is what it is. Listen, what I'll say is this: Chavez Sr. with his accomplishments, you can still argue him over Saul Canelo Alvarez. I don't have a problem with that. Chavez is within my top 10 to top 20, but I do think that Saul Canelo Alvarez is closing in, so it'll be very interesting.
No, I'm not even saying he's better. Just different
I'd
eras.
like to know, just to finish up here, I'd like to know, Sergio, where you rank.
You do have to respect different eras because every era can be somewhat different. Certain sports sciences and the PEDs and, you know, the health supplements and sports sciences are always going to improve as time goes along. So who the hell knows, you know? But at the end of the day, Saul Canelo Alvarez, do I believe that eventually maybe he can get to that level? Absolutely.
On the list of the greatest Mexican boxers
No,
of all time.
stop.
That's good. That's good.
Terrible, bro.
This motherfucker. Anyway, that's really about it overall for this video. But I just thought that I would review that because I thought that it would be very particularly interesting. But anyways, that's really about it for this video. I'll talk to you all later.